Thank you all so much for coming. This workshop is brought to you by Animal Activism Mentorship. We are a free online global program dedicated to equipping mentees with the knowledge, resources, and confidence they need to begin getting active for the animals. The workshop that we have for you all today is called Effective Activism During Kaporos, and it's hosted by myself, Penimah, Tehilah, an animal rights activist and a mentor with AAM, Shimon Yaakov Laxer, who is an animal rights and Kaporos activist, and he has studied rabbinics and Jewish literature at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And we are also joined by our very special guest speaker, Rabbi Akiva Gersh, who joins us all the way from Israel and is known colloquially as the Vegan Rabbi. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Rabbi Akiva, who's going to get us started on this whole workshop.
Amazing. Thank you. Shalom, everybody from Israel. And it's great to be here as part of this really important topic and important workshop. And so, yeah, let's jump right in. But maybe just before we do, a quick little self-bio about myself. My name is Akiva, originally from New York. As you can tell, I have an American accent. I moved to Israel in 2004 with my wife, Tamar, and we've been living here ever since, raising our 4 kids here. And my background is in Jewish and Israel education for over 20 years now. And within the Jewish education work that I do, teaching a lot about the connection between Judaism and the environment in general, and Judaism and food ethics, animal welfare, and veganism in specific. A long story, not for now, but my whole Jewish journey, I did not grow up very deeply connected to my Jewish roots or tradition. That was something that started for me in college and was spurred on by my discovery of environmental teachings in the Jewish tradition. I became vegetarian when I was 18. I became vegan when I was 19. It's been a while now. But those choices and my involvement with the environmental activist movement really, inspired me to look deeper into Judaism as I learned more about what Judaism has to say about those issues. More to that story, but just not for now. But we're going to be focusing on a very important topic. In America, a lot of people call it Kaporos. In Israel here, because we say things with a little bit of a different accent, we say Kaporos. And we'll learn more about the background and where it comes from, and even like the root of the word. But I'm going to share, a little bit of, the behind the scenes first, before we get into the specific issue of Kaporos and, what they are and how they came to be. I think it's really important to understand, who are these people that are doing it with chickens specifically, and why is it so important to them that they do it that way? All right, so I'm going to start off with that, and then I'll hand it on to our other amazing speakers to continue the sharing. So maybe we'll move to the next slide. Okay. So, okay, great, thank you. So it's really important, right? Understanding the context of this workshop and this work, this activist work, showing up, at sites where people are using chickens for this ritual is so important. In fact, it's a necessity to understand, how these people and these communities, and first and foremost, to understand that they are communities and they take community very seriously. How they view not only this tradition, this ritual, but ritual and tradition in general, because I believe that will only help activists, one, understand the people that they're trying to speak to, right? I think like the ideal form of an activist is not so much, me against you, us against them, but like on some level, like we're all in this together trying to make this world a better place, right? And not coming at you or towards you as I know better than you, and I'm holier than thou, and let me speak to you and tell you what's going on, but really to understand that sometimes we don't see every angle and every aspect, because there's so many angles and aspects in this world. It's almost impossible for any human to see them all. So for those of us who may be standing more on the side and at a distance, coming at it, understanding that they are in this community, this is their ritual and their tradition, right? And we're trying to offer another way of looking at it while at the same time understanding them as well. So really trying to understand kind of like these two vantage points. All right. So I want to speak a little bit about the idea of custom in Jewish tradition, custom specifically as law. Because as we'll see, the use of chickens for kaparot is a custom. Right? I don't want to go too deep into it because we're going to be getting into that a little bit later. But I'll just say this, I've never attended a Kaporos ritual happening where people were using chickens. All right, I and most of the other Jewish people out there who do Kaporos every single year before Yom Kippur use money. Right, that's the majority of Jews in the world today, and it's been that way for a long time. Right, but yes, there are communities that do use chickens, that still use chickens, and as much as that bothers us, and it bothers me tremendously, believe me, it's also really important to understand why they hold on to this tradition so tightly if it's actually not even technically a necessity. All right, there is another way to do it, and so I think it's important to understand that, let's even zoom out for a moment. Judaism, kind of simply put, but putting some of the pieces together, Judaism as a religion, as a practice, consists of a few major pieces and parts. There's the written Torah, which is what you find in the 5 books of Moses. Then there's the oral Torah, which actually was an oral tradition from teacher to student, from parents to kids for, almost 2,000 years of Jewish history. But in the year 200 CE, when the Jewish exile was starting to really expand and really grow all around the world, there was a rabbi named Rabbi Yehuda Nasi who started to worry that as we get further and further apart geographically as a people, we're going to lose that oral tradition because it's oral and it's not written down. And if we don't start writing it down, we might actually lose it forever. And Judaism can't exist without that oral tradition as well. So we have the written tradition, we got the oral tradition. In the year 200, this rabbi started to write down the oral tradition. 300 years, that was called the Mishnah. 300 years later, the Gemara was compiled. That was more of the oral teachings and the discussions of the oral teachings, right? And now we have that, written down in the form called the Talmud, right? But even since the Talmud was written down in the year 500 CE, over the past 1,500 years, new kind of additions, innovations, customs have been formulated or come to life throughout the Jewish journey, both in the Ashkenazi world and the Sephardi world, okay? And something that we might look at as just a custom, right? It's not written in the 5 books of Moses. It's not even written in the Gemara. It's not written in the Oral Torah, right? It's not written in the Talmud, but it's a custom that came later. That might seem like to a lot of people, so it's not really necessary. You don't have to do it. So why you either do it at all or why don't you just do it in a different kind of way? But we have to understand the Orthodox mindset, and specifically the ultra-Orthodox mindset. For them, there is a phrase that shows up many times in Jewish learning, minhag halacha, which means custom as law, which means that when a custom has been practiced by a community long enough and taken on full-heartedly, it has the strength of law. It has the power of law, right? So to the people practicing it hundreds of years later, after it was developed, even if they know that, let's go back 700 years or 1,000 years ago, and Jews weren't doing this either at all, or like we're doing it today, on some level, it doesn't matter because now we are doing it. So much time has gone by that we have been doing it like this. It has the strength of law. So that's one very important piece, I think, to understand when we're doing this kind of activism is to understand where these people are coming from. Of course, hopefully, ideally, we're not deeming them as these evil human beings who are out to destroy the world, right? They're people who are practicing their religion. Yes, there's this part of it that really bothers us as activists, right? And people care about animal welfare, and we're trying to open their eyes to that. But let's make sure we don't deem them as evil, because what are they doing? They're practicing the tradition, just like they did yesterday, right? And just like they're going to do tomorrow. Every single day of their lives, are filled with ritual and with tradition. And when they show up to that parking lot or wherever it might be, and they're waving the chicken for the 30th year in a row, whatever it might be, if not more, and then activists show up, they're kind of like, what? Like, this is what we do. This is what we do every year. This is what I've done every year. My father did it for me. I'm doing it now for my kids. Like, what's the big deal? So again, I think to the extent that we as activists can expand our awareness and our understanding of the people we're trying to speak to, it will help us to speak to them with as much love as possible, non-judgmentalness, and therefore our chances of successfully giving over our message to them will only increase. All right. To the second point here, the power and importance of tradition in the ultra-Orthodox community. Have you ever seen Fiddler on the Roof? Right? Tradition. I mean, really, I don't know, I've studied other religions and I love talking to people from other religions, up until today. But I don't know if there's a religion in the world that takes tradition as seriously as Judaism. We are obsessed with tradition. Everything's tradition. I mean, seriously, I go to like someone's Shabbat table, everyone's got their traditions, whether like the community does it or they've kind of developed it or their family has started it, whatever it might be. Judaism is so filled with traditions, and that's the color. That's the uniqueness. That's the brightness of Jewish practice are those different traditions. Does someone have to? I don't know what am I. There's a million things to think of. I'm just thinking, Sephardim on Pesach at the Seder. They do this whole play where they literally act out the leaving of Egypt at the Seder table. Do they have to do that? No, right? For them, that's an important piece of their Seder night experience in giving over the story to their kids. So tradition is so important. So in the context of Kaporos, right, we need to understand that specifically in the ultra-Orthodox community, because that's the community that is specifically doing this, right? Most of the Jewish world is not doing this. Most of the Orthodox world is not doing this. I've been Orthodox for over 20 years. And again, I've never attended one of these chicken waving ceremonies, right? It's specifically in the ultra-Orthodox community, all right? But to understand that for them, this is the tradition. This, as we'll learn shortly, it has roots. It doesn't go back to Mount Sinai. It doesn't go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years, but it does have roots, right? And we have to respect roots. But for them, it is this tradition that's like, this is what we do. Again, this is what my community does. This is what my family does. This is what my great grandfather did, right? And I'm going to do it too, because this is what we do right before Yom Kippur. So again, that kind of space and that kind of role of tradition, specifically in the ultra-Orthodox community. And the last piece I want to focus on right now, which I think is probably the most important, specifically having to do with the work that we're doing and that we're trying to do, is the influence and role of leadership in the ultra-Orthodox community. All right. The way these communities work in the Jewish world in general, but definitely way more in the Orthodox community and way more in the ultra-Orthodox community, is the position and authority of the rabbi or the community leader is so important and so central and so powerful, right? So much so that these leaders, these rabbis, really, I mean, literally with one sentence, one decision, they could change, 500 years of tradition. Literally, I'm not kidding, right? So oftentimes, in activist movements, it's a grassroots movement. Why? Because we're working from the bottom up. Like the 10 people I spoke to today, the 15 people I emailed today. In the ultra-Orthodox world, it doesn't really work that way, right? And it doesn't have to work that way. If you go to the people on the street, so to speak, on some level, this structure makes it a little bit harder to work with them and to reach them and to speak to them and to influence them. Why? Because all they have to say is, this is what my rabbi told me to do. This is what my rabbi does. See, he's right over there doing it too. This is what I do because I follow my rabbi. There is such an important value in the ultra-Orthodox community, right? Of doing what your rabbi says. I mean, literally, like you go, there are people, in certain communities, they go to the rabbi for everything. They might ask the rabbi 10 questions a week. What do I do in this situation? What do I do here? There's books of decisions made by rabbis that people can look up, and get the answer to their questions. They can WhatsApp them today. They can go to websites today. This is a very, very central thing. When you have a question, you ask the rabbi, whatever your rabbi says, that's what you do, especially in the Hasidic communities where the rabbi becomes Rebbe, which is a grand rabbi, which is a spiritual leader. Literally, whatever the Rebbe says is what you do. If he said go jump into the lake and swim for 5 miles, that's what probably most people will do in his community, right? So it's a very important thing to understand. On one level, it makes the activist work a little harder, but on another level, if we could reach those rabbis and talk to them and get a conversation with them, right? They're a little bit sometimes, depending on the size of the community, they're a little bit like superstars in their community. It's not always so easy to get, private time with them, but if you can, and you can talk to them, and you can open up their hearts, literally in a second, you just open up the hearts of the whole community. And even if it doesn't open up their hearts, as long as the rabbi says, you know what, you're right, we need to stop this. There are other ways to do this. We don't need to do this anymore. It is causing pain and suffering to animals unnecessarily. Wow, thank you for sharing that with me. That rabbi can come out like 5 minutes later and say, friends, next year we're making a change. And all of a sudden, hundreds, if not thousands of people have also made that change, right? And that just, I think, is helpful to understand, when people are going to these, activist, rallies, events, moments, to understand who are these people, that are in front of us and what world do they live in, because these things, custom as law, the influence and power of tradition and the influence of leadership are really guiding principle in their lives. So thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Rabbi, for all of that. Really incredible. Especially that last message about how effective we can be in these communities if we could really reach one person that has just such tremendous powers of good in these communities. If we open up their hearts to this message that we're trying to spread, that's really something that I really want to take to heart. But I want to move a little bit now and start speaking about Kaporos specifically. After doing activism for Kaporos this past year, it was actually my first time doing activism for Kaporos. I realized there is so much misinformation on behalf of the people that are coming to these communities and trying to do right and defend these chickens. But unless we actually show that we know what we're talking about, we know what Kaporos is, we know what it means, we know where it comes from, if we can't show that we have an idea of what we're speaking about, no one is going to listen to us, and the discussion will shut down immediately. I saw this happen around me as some people in these communities were walking over to see what we had to hear what we had to say. And it's quite obvious when someone hasn't done any of the reading, any of the research, and sometimes the information is not so easy to access. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a tour of Jewish literature. Rabbi Akiva spoke to us about this body of literature of answers, where rabbis write answers to questions. This is one of the most important types of literature in Jewish tradition. It's called Responsa Literature, where a rabbi, a big rabbi of the community, receives a question, and that rabbi writes a response, and these responses are collected and are preserved and are read over and over and over from generation to generation. But before we start that tour, we're going to go back to the Bible itself and see the origin, not just of Kaporos, but of the word Kaporos. So it comes from a Hebrew word. There's a verb in Hebrew, likaper, which means to atone or to cleanse. This is one of the most repeated words, which shows up throughout the book of Leviticus, which deals with the rituals in the portable tent in which the God of Israel was dwelling in the desert. It has kind of a twofold meaning, to atone, to cleanse, where the Israelites believed that there was a force in the world, not necessarily a morally bad force, but just a force that had a kind of effect on the God of Israel that would repel him from the community, from the encampment of the Israelites. And this was called, in English, we call it impurity. But the word impurity kind of has almost like a moral valence to it. It didn't really exist for them. They thought of it as tuma, almost like a germ. And if you didn't bring this impurity, this tuma, into the tent where God was dwelling, then it didn't have a bad effect. It was okay for it to be on people. It was okay for it to be around, as long as it wasn't brought into the tent where the God of Israel lived. And if it was brought into the tent, God would almost experience an allergic reaction and pull himself back from the presence of the people of Israel. Okay, Yom HaKippurim, you can see the same word here, Kippur, Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonement, the Day of Cleansing, is when the priests would cleanse the whole temple of all of the impurity, all the tumah that had gathered, that had collected over the last year. And the climax of the Yom HaKippurim ritual was the slaughtering of a goat and the sprinkling of the blood on top of the throne of God, which is called the Ark of the Holy. And in Hebrew, it's also called the Kaporet, the top of the Ark itself, where God's feet was believed to be resting. So the priests would take this blood, they would sprinkle it on the horns of the altar, and they would sprinkle it in a few other places strategically. And blood had an incredible power in the ancient world. The ancient Israelites recognized, or they believed, that blood can cleanse themselves and can cleanse the tent of God of this tumah. And by sprinkling blood and wiping it away, the place is cleansed of impurity as well. So you could already see possibly the buds of what would evolve over time to become the idea of Kaporot as we know it. But what we do, we as in the contemporary Jews, of course I've never participated in Kaporot myself, what Jews these days do is they take the chicken and they swing it around their heads, and they believe that by offering this chicken in place of themselves, that their life can be spared. Yom Kippurim is believed to be a judgment day when God judges all of humankind. And if you're judged unfavorably, you might not live to see a whole other year. You might be actually forfeit your life. So how do we get from this in the Bible, blood as a cleansing ritual, to this ritual of Kaporot as we have it today? So we have a few dots we have to connect. Okay, now we're going to go to the era just past the Talmud. Rabbi Akiva mentioned the Talmud. The Talmud is the most, I'm going to go back just a little bit as I talk for a second. The Talmud might be the most important collection of work, of discussions of Jewish law. It was completed around the year 600, 700, depending on when different scholars date the very end. It went through an editing process even after the main body was completed. But after the completion of the Talmud is when the heads of two major authorities in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, in two cities called Sura and Pumbedita, they would receive questions from Jews all over the world who are trying to understand their rituals and their literature. And these were known as the greats. The rabbis who were teaching in these two seminaries were the ones that everybody was looking to for explanations and for answers. And in the 7th century CE, in the 600s, mid-600s, one of the heads of one of these two academies receives the following question. Here's the question he gets. We, meaning the community that wrote to him, have the custom of slaughtering a rooster before Yom HaKippurim, but we don't know the reason for doing so. So they have this tradition, they're not sure where it comes from. If this tradition is because we are offering the life of the rooster in exchange for our own, why is a rooster preferable to any other kind of animal? So by looking closely at this question, we can uncover just a little bit about what's going on in this community. First of all, we could see from the question that they all believed that a rooster was preferable, or that everybody was using roosters. They don't know why. It seems like it was very widespread. It was a widespread custom. And they asked their own authorities in their own community as to why they're doing it, and no one really knows. So this rabbi, the head of this academy, his name is Rav Sheshna. I paraphrased his answer. He breaks it down into basically 2 points. Point number 1, he says, a rooster is just more readily available than any other animals, i.e. you could use other animals, but most people happen to have access to roosters, unlike other maybe bigger, more expensive animals. But he goes on, although horned animals are preferred, like the ram that was substituted for Isaac. So I'm not going to do a pop quiz now and ask if anybody knows what exactly this is referring to. I'll just give you the story in a few sentences. There's a moment in the book of Genesis where Abraham, the first of the founding fathers of the Israelite people, is told by God to bring his son as an offering on Mount Moriah, meaning to kill his son, to offer his son as a sacrifice. His son, of course, was that which was most cherished to Abraham out of everything that Abraham had in his household, in his possession. And he does immediately. He brings his son to the location, and just as he's about to kill his son, an angel shows up and says, "Don't do it. Now I know you truly fear our God, and you will be rewarded for your faithfulness and for being so willing to give even that which you cherish the most." Abraham looks up and sees a ram stuck in the bushes and decides, oh, if the son of my life is spared, I still wish to offer a gift to God. I will kill this ram instead. And he does, and the ram was seen to be a favorable offering in this story. So let's go back to Rav Sheshna's answer. Why is a rooster preferable? So number one, it's just more readily available. Although horned animals like the ram that Abraham offered are preferred, because that's a moment in the Hebrew Bible itself where we see an animal being substituted as a gift to God for the life of a human being. He gives another answer, that it's wordplay on the word for rooster. I don't know how anybody's Aramaic is, ancient Aramaic here on the call, but in Aramaic, the word for rooster is gavra, which shows up in the Talmud many times. And the word in Hebrew for man is gever. So he says, if you could choose any animal, since the animal is being a substitute for the life of a man, for a gever, it's kind of a cute wordplay to use a rooster because gever and gavra are so similar. So that's Rav Sheshna's answer. Okay, this, as far as I know, is the earliest reference in Jewish literature that we have to the Kaporos Ritual. This responsa was written around when the Talmud was being completed, and the Talmud is a massive collection of discussion on Jewish law. It actually takes up more than one bookshelf. It's bigger than an encyclopedia. Nowhere in there does it mention Kaporos. Rabbi Akiva mentioned this. But when Jews claim that it goes back to Talmudic times, that's because there is references to ancient Jewish literature. This goes back upwards of almost 1,500 years already. Okay. Here's just a map to show what area of the world we're speaking about. That was written here in Surah. This is the center of Jewish authority and Jewish learning. The whole world would turn to them and listen to them. Here's Israel, all the way on the left. Instructions for the ritual. So in that same letter, Rav Sheshna then goes on to explain the procedure from beginning to end of what people need to be doing to fulfill or to practice this Kaporos ritual before Yom Kippur. 5 steps. Number one person places his hand on the rooster's head, then puts his hand on the head of the person seeking kapara, seeking the atonement, and recites this in place of this in exchange for this one is forgiven because of this. There are a few verses from Psalm 107 that are then recited, and finally finishing with the phrase, a life for a life. Jews believe that on Yom Kippur, all of our lives are at risk. We're standing on the brink, and we are begging for a favorable just judgment from heaven. And if our life is going to be spared, then maybe by offering some kind of a gift or a substitute that would alleviate any kind of guilt that's lingering that we were not able to atone for it ourselves. So a life for a life. Repeat the above 6 times, which means this ritual is done 7 times totally, 7 being a holy number in Jewish tradition, the Sabbath every 7 days. Place hand on the head of the rooster and recite. This one goes to death in place of this one. Then place hand on participants. So it seems like there's 2 people involved. One person is kind of effecting the ritual for someone else. So the person who's affecting the ritual places hand on the participant and recites, enter so-and-so, John Smith, into life and not to death. Repeat 2 times, slaughter the rooster. And that's the end of the ritual, according to Rav Sheshna. In this responsa, the Hebrew word for responsa is tshuva, which means to return, you return an answer. So that's the end of the ritual in this teshuvah of Rav Sheshna. So how many people here have heard this before when speaking to Jews during the Kaporos week? It's okay, because the chicken will then be given to the needy. So people eat chicken all throughout the world, right? And there are even some people that care about animal welfare or who claim to care for animal welfare and yet still eat chickens because they believe that as long as chickens are handled humanely, they believe that that's possible, that their life can be brought to an end and then we can eat from their flesh. So if you believe that we have a right and there's nothing wrong with eating animals as long as they're handled humanely before the moment of their death, so what's wrong with just doing a ritual with the chickens first, as long as they're held maybe gently while they're being waved around the head of the participant? So I heard this many, many, many times. So let's look into this. First of all, does anybody see anything about giving the body of the chicken to the needy in Rav Sheshn's letter, in the paraphrase that I gave to you? No, you do not. And if you looked at the letter itself, you wouldn't see it there either. I didn't just skip that part. Okay, so where does this claim come from that it's okay to do this ritual? Because it's not like their bodies are going to waste. They will be given to the needy. The needy needs to eat anyway. And maybe they would have gone and bought parts of a chicken with money they would have received from charity. So what's the difference if we're doing the killing ourselves? Okay, so first I have to teach you about a concept called Darchei HaAmori, which means the way of the Amorites. The Amorites was one of the tribes to the east of the Jordan that the Israelite people were in perpetual conflict with. So there's a biblical prohibition, comes from the book Leviticus, and here's the translation of the Hebrew. Like the deeds of those in the land of Egypt, amongst whom you, the Israelites, used to dwell, you shall not do. And like the deeds of the land of Canaan, to where I am bringing you, you shall not do. Nor according to their statutes may you walk. This is said by the God of Israel to the people of Israel while they're in the desert. They're in this space between Egypt and the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. So what does God say? Don't act like the people amongst whom you dwelled. We have our own ways. We have our own traditions, our own laws. Live according to those which I am giving to you, which are from heaven, not according to those of the rest of the people of the world. This would come to be called Darchei HaAmori. And this phrase, Darchei HaAmori, would end up referring to any kind of practice that is superstitious in nature, that other people that aren't Jewish are doing, that Jews happen to like and start doing as well. They would then be seen to be transgressing this prohibition of not going like the ways of the Amorites being a stand-in for the ways of the other people of the world. So keep that in mind as we look at yet another teshuvah, another responsa from another authority from Spain. This is a few hundred years later. It's no longer the case that Sur and Pumbedita were the central places of authority. There are now giants of Torah scholarship elsewhere throughout the world. One of whom was Rabbi Shlomov and Avraham in the 1200s of Spain. And he's speaking about Kaporos as well in this letter. He says, in our town, people would slaughter the chickens and cut off the head and hang it by the feathers in the doorway with garlic. And all of this is utter nonsense, as this seems to be Darchei HaAmori in my eyes. He then goes on, and this next comment is not about the practice of hanging the chicken head, it's about Kaporos in general. Even though I heard from many upright and reputable sources that many rabbis participate in Kaporot, I still prohibit my community from joining in. Rabbi Shlomov ben Avraham, what does he say? He gives another way that people are kind of doing a Kaporot-like ritual. They kill the chicken. Maybe they give the rest of the body to charity, maybe not, he doesn't say, but at least the heads they're hanging up with garlic, and he says, I don't like that at all. This clearly seems to me to be a case of Darchei HaAmori, living life with the superstitions of non-Jewish people amongst whom we dwell, and bringing their ways into our tradition, into our minhag, into our customs, okay? But even if they're not doing that, and even if they're just doing kaporot where the chicken is just killed, and they're not hanging the head, I don't like when my community does this, despite the fact that I've heard from upright and reputable sources that they themselves do it. And by the way, Rabbi Shlomov ben Avraham, also known in Jewish circles as the Rashba, was himself very much an upright and reputable source, one of the greatest from this era. Okay, I think I have 2 more to go over with you. Okay, same time, around the same time, Rav Asher ben Yechiel, another giant of Jewish scholarship, he says, and the chicken is then usually given to the needy so as to be an atonement for his soul. So almost seems like by giving the chicken to someone who can't afford a chicken but for themselves, that when they receive the chicken acts as an atonement for them too. But then he goes on, this is a really interesting comment, while we, his community and maybe his own custom, we generally throw the innards onto the roof to feed them to the birds. Okay, we'll come back to this in a moment. Okay, last one, I think. This is 300 years later, Rabbi David ben Solomon. It seems reasonable to me, he says, that as long as the chicken is given to charity after it is killed, we're seeing this idea more and more, that even Rabbi Shlomo ben Avraham, the one who said he doesn't like his community doing this, would permit this custom. Okay, I think that concludes my panorama. So now I have 3 questions as we think about these writings from almost 1,000 years of Jewish history. Okay, question number 1. What does Rabbi David ben Solomon's comment tell us about the people in Rabbi Shlomo ben Avraham's community? I know it's a lot of rabbis, Rabbi this, Rabbi that, a lot of names that are hard to remember. So let's go back for a sec. So what does Rabbi David ben Solomon's comments tell us about the people in this other community? He says, it is reasonable to me that as long as the chicken is given to charity, that this rabbi would permit it. So therefore, what can we conclude about this rabbi's community? What was happening with the chicken bodies after they were killed? If someone wants to shout out, you can. If you want to put something in the chat, feel free. I'll just give you a second. They weren't being given to charity. I don't know what was being done with the bodies. Maybe they were eating them. It just doesn't tell us. It just says they were being killed. So that's conclusion number 1. What does Rav Asher ben Yechiel's comment teach us about the importance of what happens to the body of the chickens after they are killed? So Asher ben Yechiel, what did he say? Chicken is usually given to the needy so as to be an atonement for their soul, while we throw the innards onto the roof to feed the birds. Well, my conclusion from his answer is that it doesn't really matter what happens after you kill the chicken. There's a handful of things you could do. Once you reach the slaughtering of the chicken, which is the very end of Rav Shesna's instructions, you've reached the end of the ritual, you've accomplished what you need to do for kaparot, and therefore it doesn't really matter. Finally, what does this teach us about the claim that people would only participate in kaparot as long as the chicken's flesh would be given to the needy? I'll say from personal experience, it was devastating seeing what was happening to these carcasses after the chickens were killed. It was such a waste of precious life. There were garbage cans lining up property on the streets by the garbage dumps of bodies of chickens that were moments ago healthy and didn't want to die. And they weren't going to the needy. There were instances when they were, but most people didn't stay around to make sure that was happening. They brought their chickens, they paid for their chickens, and as long as the chicken was waved and the chicken's throat was then sliced, they were happy, they washed their hands, and they left. Personally, I think that this idea that the chickens have to be given to charity, after doing reading and visiting these communities and speaking with people, I think that's apologetics. It sounds nice when we hear that, and we like to believe that that's the case because people need to eat, right? And so this is a good thing that someone is receiving food who otherwise would be hungry, but it's not true. And even if it were true, it doesn't mean that it would be right. But that is something that maybe we could use in effective activism by saying, actually, it's not quite the case that they're being given to, that these chickens' bodies are being donated to charity, and that's not even an integral part of the ritual itself. Okay, I think I'm a little over time. I'm gonna now pass it over to Penimah, Tehilah, to take us forward. So thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Shim. I think it's so important to get really the history of Kaporos before we talk about activism, because it's not until we're knowledgeable about these things that we can really do effective activism. So if you want to stop sharing your screen, I can share my screen. There we go. Okay. So Give me 1 second. Okay. Can you all see the slide that says action? Okay, great. So now that we've got a lot of history and a lot of knowledge and understanding about where Kaporos comes from, I'm going to talk a little bit about action. So what we do when maybe we found out about Kaporos, maybe you're finding out about Kaporos for the first time in general, or you realize that Kaporos happens in your hometown, the town you're staying in. So here's some things that you can do about it. So I think the first thing you need to keep in mind when considering doing anything for Kaporos is keeping in mind your objective. So you just have to know your objective before you can really get any direction. So a good question to ask yourself is, what do I want to achieve this year? What do I want to achieve during the week of Kaporos, the week leading up to Yom Kippur? Do I want to focus on in-the-moment rescue, or do I want to focus on long-term ending the practice? And either of these answers is fine. And honestly, you're going to want to pick one or the other depending on where you are in your journey. So say you find out about Kaporos in general, like a couple weeks before Yom Kippur, a couple weeks before Kaporos is scheduled to happen, you're not going to you don't really have the time to start implementing long-term effective action. So you'll want to focus on rescue versus if you're finding out about Kaporos now, and you know that it happens in your community right now, Kaporos isn't for almost another year. So long-term is going to be a much more effective end goal for you at this time. So moving on, if rescue is your objective. So something I like to keep in mind when thinking about rescue is that rescue is very, very important, right? You're making a real difference for the beings that you're rescuing in the moment. You're literally making their whole world of difference for them. However, it won't save next year's chickens. So what I mean by that is that when trying to end Kaporos, if you want to end chickens as Kaporos as a practice in your community or elsewhere, rescue should not be the end-all be-all goal. Because, this for a number of reasons. The first one that comes to mind is that you can kind of get into an enabling kind of mindset. Say the rabbis, have overordered chickens. They don't sell don't sell like 10. And then you offer to take them off their hands year after year. They're not incentivized to change their ways. And they don't really have to deal with the problem. I hate referring to animals in those terms. However, this is, how they would view it. I have 10 extra chickens. What do I do with them? Oh, I don't actually have to face that problem because then this person will just take it off my hands. So that being said, something you can do to have effective rescue in the moment, say you've been doing, all of these other things year round and you're focusing on rescue, find out rabbi's contact information and reach out before Kaporos happens to maybe negotiate rescue, to talk about the possibility of rescue, just to really get your foot in the door, introduce yourself, let them know who you are. You can do this by, if you're involved with the local Jewish community, I'm sure, you'll be able to find the rabbi's contact information. You can also just maybe go to the synagogue and go to the synagogue after services, talk with them face to face. You can also, hold on one sec. Sorry about that. You can also try asking if they have any birds that are not fit for shechita. That's something that when Shimon and I were up north doing rescue efforts for Kaporos, that is a tactic that we tried. So shechita means slaughter. It's like the term for kosher slaughter. So birds who have injuries that they're not able to recover from are not fit for kosher slaughter. So rabbis or butchers may be willing to give those birds to you rather than birds that they view, oh, I can make money off of this bird. So that's a good, especially if this is your first year doing it and you don't really have the groundwork laid of community action, you can always just ask if they have any birds that they were realistically probably going to throw in the garbage anyway. Any sick or injured birds that they may be willing to give you, and then you can possibly save their life. Also, something that I really, really want to stress, this is probably my most important tip for rescue. have vets, fosters, and sanctuaries lined up before your Kaporos rescue. If you just go in and are rescuing, say, 10 birds, and you haven't thought that far ahead of, who's going to foster them, if anybody, if they have injuries, especially if you're asking for birds who aren't fit for slaughter, who's going to triage them? Where are they going to live for the rest of their life? These are things that you really, really need to think about before taking birds, or else you might be rescuing them from obviously a terrible situation, but it might be, maybe they won't even survive if you don't have proper vet care lined up. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Okay, so moving away from short-term rescue and more towards long-term action. So there are kind of two facets that I try to keep in mind when thinking about the long term. So community action is very important. As Rabbi Akiva said, and Shim said, change will come from the top down in these communities. I truly, truly believe that even if Kaporos is made illegal, permanent change is going to come from within. If the public slaughter of animals is made illegal, it's just going to happen in backyards, in, like just on private property. That's not to say that we shouldn't take legal action. I definitely think we should, and I'll talk about that in a second. However, I think meaningful long-term change is going to happen within the communities from the rabbis or the rebbes top down. Going along with that, building relationships within the community is vital, and it is key. Calling the rabbi and offering to have discussions, just like talking with them, really laying the groundwork, letting them know you're not like a crazy activist who just shows up once a year to yell at people about Kaporos, even though you might do that as well. Just really laying the groundwork and just having a conversation with them. This is another point that kind of goes along with community action, and it might be somewhat controversial upon first reading it, offering temporary solutions and welfarist options. So a tactic that comes to mind is up north, there's a community in New Jersey that has been doing the Kaporos efforts for a few years, and they've convinced a number of rabbis from various communities to use baskets. So they're like flexible plastic baskets that they put the chickens in before they swing them. And first of all, it is more comfortable for the chickens, so you're not like restraining them by their wings and holding them by their legs, which is very stressful for them. Obviously, they all end up slaughtered just moments later, but that's good because it's less stressful for the chickens. But also, it gets your foot in the door with the communities. It gets them giving you an inch, so to say. If they're willing to recognize that these chickens are living, breathing, feeling beings who do feel uncomfortable when they're held by their wings, so they're willing to use a basket one year. Maybe next year they're willing to use less chickens, and then maybe only one chicken for the whole community, and then eventually no chickens. So it gets them giving you an inch, and just gets them on your side a little bit. So moving on to legal action that you can take. Again, this is my number one tip for legal action. You have to document every single thing you see. Always have either your phone out, if you're on public property, or like small cameras that maybe people can't immediately see, or even just audio. You need to document, because this goes along with my next point, capitalizing on existing city and state restrictions on religious slaughter. So there is a lot of aspects that happen routinely during Kaporos that are illegal, depending on your city and your state. So if you're documenting on public property and even on private property, and they're doing something that's illegal and against the law, you could use that documentation to then call and report things to police. And then you can get maybe these slaughter sites even potentially legally shut down. You could get the people fined, so it's harder for them to do it next year. And it's also just all on record of, there's no way to do this that doesn't break the law. That goes along with my next point. To go to city council meetings, town hall meetings, and get the issue of Kaporos on the agendas. Get your city officials talking about Kaporos every single time you can speak publicly at a town council meeting. Be there, talk about Kaporos. If you have a lot of documentation, You can bring it up every single time, when there's blood and entrails in the streets from slaughtering thousands of chickens in one night. Obviously that endangers, not only is it horrible animal cruelty that might even be against the law, depending on where you are, but it also puts the public at risk. It puts these communities at risk. So going to town council meetings and bringing up violations, documentations, and just the issue of Kaporos as a whole is so, so important. So next, we're going to talk about outreaching to Hasidic communities. And I'm going to toss it over to Rabbi Akiva Gersh to talk about that.
Okay, thank you, Penimah, and Shimon and Penimah, amazing presentations, really, really just thoughtful and in-depth and such important information for people. And really, this information should spread far and wide, and I really, really believe will help people be even more successful in the future with all of their activist work. And I just want to, maybe, I mean, it's already very strong. I just want to maybe strengthen one point. Just the idea of if one of your goals is, and I believe it should be, to reach out to the leaders, to the rabbis, to start early. Like literally now is not too early to reach out to the rabbinic leaders. This is a big change for them. And if there is going to be anyone out there who's going to be open to change, we have to understand, we have to be sensitive, right? A real sensitivity to what it means, going back to what I shared before, what it means to change a tradition. Right? It's not just, a one conversation thing. Even if they are inspired after one conversation, and I believe they could and should, they still feel that weight on their shoulders of centuries of doing this ritual and their community, doing this ritual in this kind of way. To make a change like that, from one year to the next, it's a really big deal in the Jewish community in general, again, and the ultra-Orthodox community in specific. And again, having that awareness and that sensitivity. So give yourself time, like literally call that rabbi tomorrow, or try to get an appointment. And rabbis of this kind of stature are usually very, very busy. So if they give you 5 minutes of your time, of their time, don't be offended. That is an amazing amount of time. These rabbis meet with so many people every single day. To sit down with one of them for 5 minutes, that means, okay, I'm listening to you, and I care about what you're saying. In those 5 minutes, many of these rabbis have a really incredible ability to listen, and they don't need 5 hours. Right? They can just hear it, 5 minutes, they take it in, they digest it, and hopefully you're going to continue that conversation and hopefully affect that change. And again, give yourself that time. I can't strengthen that point enough. Moving on to this part of the workshop, right? So again, objections and justifications. We've heard a bit of this both from Shimon and from Penimah already, and just kind of bring it all together. That when you're out there, you're in the field, and you're at an action, and you're trying to make a difference, and you're speaking with people, and you're present, and you're making a presence, which is also very, very important in and of itself. Right? What are the things you're going to hear? Right? It's important to know that beforehand, what you're going to hear these people say in response to your questions or your challenges. Right? We've already said we give the meat to poor people who need it. Right? Like we already heard, that's not always the case. Many of these animals die even before the slaughter because of the conditions that they're transported in. Right? The way that they're transported to these ritual sites are often the same way that they're transported to slaughter, right? In crowded and cramped and horrendous conditions. So many of them don't even make it out of the cage to even be used in the ritual. All right, and then those that don't even make it to the slaughter because they're forgotten about, they're left, people leave, or they just, there's something wrong with them, or they die for whatever other reason, and they never actually get onto the plate of a poor person, which is supposed to be, the justification for this whole ritual on some level. I think it's also important to bring into the conversation, and it's not something that we brought in before, but I don't know. It might sound a little strange, for ultra-Orthodox Jews to hear this argument being shared with them from animal rights activists on the site of this ritual taking place. but I think it might come up, and it might just be another extra thing you can say or share, another little tool in your toolbox. But in Judaism, it's really important to know that while I said, before the importance of tradition, right, it's also important to know that there is a difference given between laws that come from the Torah and laws that came afterwards that are called rabbinic laws and customs. Right? They are treated differently in certain circumstances, right? I'm not going to go into all the details right now, but I'll just say this for now as it pertains to this specific issue. To go against a Torah law, right? And I'm thinking about two in specific. One is not causing unnecessary pain and suffering to animals. That's a Torah law called Sar Bal Chayim. The second one is called Bal Tashchit, which means do not waste. Don't waste anything, any resources in this world for no reason. So taking a chicken, using it in the ritual, and putting it to the side, and it never actually gets to, a poor person's table, that is a waste. That's a waste of life. That's a waste of, I don't want to call it an animal a resource, but it is a major example of waste. And that's a Torah commandment. That's a Torah law. So there's no way. Judaism doesn't allow someone to fulfill a rabbinic law, right? And definitely not a custom, which this is. This is not a rabbinic law. Okay, as we saw, from Shimon already, there's many rabbis who are against this, both in, more ancient times and definitely in modern times as well, all right, including Orthodox rabbis today. So you cannot fulfill a custom, right, that will break a Torah law. That's just absolutely not allowed in Judaism, right? In general, again, and definitely in the ultra-Orthodox community. So that's just another something to have in mind that you might be able to use if it comes up. Anyway. Going on, this is a religious tradition. We have freedom of religion in this country. You're definitely right. You have freedom of religion. If you went through all the different steps, to get the permission to do this thing in this public space, right? But in a sensitive way, and again, understanding, them and us, and we're all on the same side on some level. We're trying to be right. Explaining to them that this is a religious tradition, and I honor your religion, and I respect your religion, and I definitely honor and respect your freedom of religion. But I also know that your religion, right, demands compassion for animals, right? And whether you're Jewish or non-Jewish, you're Jewish, but you maybe don't look religious, so much. Maybe you're even religious, but you don't look religious like they do. Whatever the category is that you're in, it might sound funny for them, to hear from somebody that isn't in their world anything about Judaism, like you're talking to me about Judaism. But you can say very kindly, I obviously I don't know as much as you, not nearly as much, but I do know that Judaism respects, compassion for animals, or I'm sorry, teaches about, and it's a major, major value, right? So I respect your freedom of religion, but I also know what your religion says about not wasting, about not causing unnecessary pain and suffering to animals. And again, those are things you can just widen the conversation here. Another thing that you might hear and probably have heard already them say is, you're coming to us. We're like a few Jews in a parking lot, with some chickens. You know how many chickens are slaughtered every day in America, for food? You're coming to us. Why don't you go to Tyson or something else and do a massive action, right? There's much bigger issues out there. Leave us alone. I think that's also a sensitivity in this, ultra-Orthodox Jews in America specifically, right? I grew up in America. It's been 17 years since I left, but I know, this is my family who still lives there and just growing up there, that oftentimes when ultra-Orthodox Jews make the headlines, make the news, it's not a positive thing, right? They're usually bashed in the media. They're usually portrayed in a very negative light. I told you guys before, I didn't grow up religious. My town that I grew up in was 10 minutes away from the ultra-Orthodox community. And the people in my town, including the Jews, which made up 50% of my town, thought the worst of them, right? And anything we heard about them in the media just, supported that. And I think that's also part of the sensitivity that, activists have to have, that they feel threatened, they feel attacked, right? And they might chalk it up as anti-Semitism, or they might just chalk it up as, adding to the list of stereotypes that people have about them. But I think, going into the action, understanding that already will help you, be more aware, be more sensitive, be more loving, and also be more ready to confront that and have an answer to that. All right, so ways of responding and communicating, I kind of already answered them as I was bringing these up, but just straight up saying, look, I know I respect your religion, but I know it's not a legal requirement in Judaism to use a chicken. So many of my Jewish friends use money. I use money if you're a Jew and you do this, right? You can do the same ritual without without causing such pain and suffering to an animal, right? Moving on from there, we respect your traditions. And just repeating what I said already before about Judaism, caring about animals, countless laws and teachings about having compassion for animals, and bringing that up in the conversation and see what they say. They might not, buy it. They might not agree with you. They might not put the chicken down and run home and get some money, but it might keep the conversation going. It might give them something to think about. And of course, we know this as activists, right? We have to, or we'll get tired of doing this work. That the difference we're making, we might not see with our own eyes in the here and the now, right? But we might make a difference next year. Who knows? If we have a really, really, open and respectful conversation with someone this year, that could affect them next year. Next year, they might not show up. They say, you know what? I didn't think of that. That person at that parking lot, where I was not expecting to talk about, they made a really good point. And I'm going to stay home next year. You never know, right? You never know with this kind of work. The last thing I would say is, I think it might be cut up on the screen, but that's fine. An important thing to share is that let's remember, why are people doing this? And Shimon did such a great job sharing the historical context with us, right? And the details of this ritual. People are doing this, right, straight up in order to, get God to have mercy on them before Yom Kippur. Okay, it's done between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which in Judaism is looked at as this time period of spiritual judgment. Right? Lots of things get judged for the entire year during these days. Right, and again, ultra-Orthodox Jews take this very seriously. Right? They really believe whatever you do during this time period from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur will affect the rest of the year. And that's one of the things that motivates them to do the kapara with the chickens for all the reasons we heard already before. But kindly remind them, like, wow. So in preparation for Yom Kippur, when we are asking for heavenly mercy, how could it be that a ritual that is so cruel is going to bring divine mercy into your life? How do you understand that? Right? And I think that's another thing we could bring up into the conversation, right? Is to show that if we want mercy, and we're getting kind of very religious in this part of the conversation, but it's important to understand their mindset, which is very much guided at all times by the Jewish religion, right? Is to say, at this time when we're asking for mercy, we need to be merciful ourselves, and that's also another very big Jewish concept. We're asking for something, we need to embody that as well. We need to exemplify the thing we're actually asking for. So, it would be laughable to be really, really cool, and at the same time, while you're being really, really cool, please have mercy on me, while you're holding this chicken like by the wings, and it's like freaking out and like having like a really painful experience, and then going to be tossed to the side, and who knows what happens to it, right? So I believe these are on one side ways that we can understand these communities and the people in these communities and what they're thinking while they do this ritual and what brings them to the ritual. And on the other side, knowing that, yes, we do have different opinions. And we believe, even though I respect your religion, I believe that this doesn't have to happen. And I want you also to hear me. I want to listen to you. I want you to hear me. I want to have a conversation, right? Because I do believe that next year, this can be done in a much better way, right? For you and the chickens, everyone all together. So thank you again for listening, and great to be a part of this really important workshop.
Thank you so much, Akiva. Yeah, those are such great tips. I can say that the three objections that you heard were probably the three that I heard the most when I was up doing Kaporos activism up north this past year. Okay, well, we're almost at the end. I do have just one more slide I want to share with you all, or I guess two kind of more. So a couple things to keep in mind. This is just some tips for, again, effective activism during the week of Kaporos. This is probably the things that I wish I'd been told before. So just some things that are undoubtedly going to happen while you're there if you're protesting. You're probably going to get called anti-Semitic. So I want to kind of break it down and help you understand why this remark might be said to you. It's pretty easy, if a Jewish person calls you anti-Semitic, you'll just say, "Oh, I know I'm not anti-Semitic. They're just upset that I'm challenging them." But I want to help you understand why that might have been said. So Orthodox or very religious Jews are the #1 receiver of anti-religious persecution in America, at least. These groups have faced very, very real anti-Semitism. I can pretty much guarantee, I think, that everybody who participates in Kaporos has faced very real anti-Semitism, religious violence, persecution at some point in their life. And they don't know you as a person. They don't know that you're vegan. They think that you're just there specifically trying to target a Jewish practice. And I assume that everybody on this call is vegan. And if you're not, I would encourage you to look into why you think slaughtering chickens for religious sacrifice is wrong and not slaughtering chickens for food, but that's a whole different thing. But this is why you might be called that. In response, even if you're Jewish, you might get called anti-Semitic, or at least they may say what you're doing is anti-Semitic. In response to that, because I got called that a little bit, not called it directly, but just said, don't you think this whole display, this whole protest is anti-Semitic? Like Rabbi Akiva just said, go to Tyson or McDonald's and choose something else. We're just a couple of Jews in a parking lot. Explain that you're vegan and that you care about all animal suffering, and you're not just like picking on the Jewish people. And usually they're still not going to agree maybe with what you're doing, but at least they'll know you're not coming at them from a genuinely hateful place. This other thing at the bottom, protesting on public property is activism. Protesting on private property is ineffective harassment. So let me explain that a little bit. If you're protesting in public, you can do whatever you want. You're on public property. If you're protesting on private property and you're being belligerent, which in public property is fine. On private property, they'll just call the police and get you escorted off, and it'll no longer be effective. You won't reach any people, and you might tarnish your reputation in the community and maybe ruin any chance of any community outreach you had planned further on. So I definitely think that going to private properties and keeping interactions focused on undercover documentation and negotiation of rescue is very, very important and should be done if thought about. And protests on public property should be focused on education, bringing up opposing rabbinical opinions, and getting Kaporos sites legally shut down for some of the things I covered earlier on about legal action you can take. But yeah, protests, I would generally stay away from protesting in the typical sense of like signs, megaphones. I would stay away from that on private property. I do think it would be ineffective and it might even hurt your chances of rescuing chickens or interacting with communities in the coming years. So one last thing I wanted to say was just a word about blending in. And that kind of goes about talking about going on private property. You might think that you're blending in if you're going like on these private properties to do some undercover documentation, but I can promise you that you're probably not blending in. To you, jeans and a t-shirt is like normal people stuff. You're blending in. Usually Kaporos rituals and Kaporos slaughter sites that are on private property are in very religious neighborhoods. People generally know each other, or at least they all dress very similar. So you're definitely going to stick out. And kind of a shameless promo, AAM is actually having another workshop, I believe next week or the week after, on effective undercover documentation. So if you'd like to learn more about how to effectively do that, how to blend into any situation more, attend that. But I did just want to make a note there when I was doing Kaporos activism up in New York up north this past year. I did get some activists say like, oh, I'm just going to walk by, I'll blend in. They won't see me like have my iPhone out taking a picture. But it's just something to keep in mind that they for sure noticed. But I just wanted to say that. And then real quick, here are some resources that I think are very beneficial to anybody, whatever stage you are at learning about Kaporos. Even if you're not an activist who wants to necessarily take action, it's just really good to be in the know. And if you're watching this on YouTube, these resources will be in the description. And if you're watching this live, like right now on Zoom, we'll put them in the chat. But here is a link to inchickensIsKaporos.com. They're a New York-based Kaporos-focused activism website. They're very, very comprehensive. We have a lot of resources there. So I definitely suggest going there to learn more about Kaporos. Also, these two posts, these two links, this is an Israeli publication calling for the end of chickens as Kaporos. And this is an article from the Jerusalem Post calling to end chickens as Kaporos. These are good resources to maybe get, they both have a lot of opposing rabbinical opinions. So if you are able to meet with rabbis of local communities, these would both be good things to share. They're both pretty recent. I think one's from 2020 and the other one's from 2021. So they're recent, they're Israeli publications, and they have focused a lot on opposing rabbinical opinions. So I'll be sure to put those either in the YouTube description or the Zoom chat here. But that is actually it. That is the end of our presentation. We're going to open it up to question and answer. We have a few minutes for that. So I just want to say thank everybody for attending so much. I certainly learned a lot from this presentation, even though I was hosting it. I learned a ton from both Shim and Rabbi Akiva. So I guess we'll open it up to question and answer. Feel free to unmute yourself, ask out loud, or put your question in the chat if you have anything. So I just saw a question pop up in the chat. Someone said, is there also activism surrounding the goat slaughter at Yom Kippur? I guess I direct that more towards Shim or Rabbi. I'm not super familiar with that, if either of you would like to cover that one.
I'm not sure what that's in reference to. That's not a Jewish custom as far as I know.
I think I might be wrong, but I think that's a reference to what used to happen in the temple in Jerusalem. It does talk about that in the Torah, that on Yom Kippur in the temple, they had two goats, and one was sacrificed and one was sent out into the wilderness. But that doesn't happen anymore. That hasn't happened in like 2,000 years, and that will never happen again in Jewish practice. So there's no need for activism. That was taken care of.
Great, that's like one less thing we have to worry about as activists.
That'd be really hard, because that would be like protesting against God. So
yeah, that might be a little out of our wheelhouse, but
that's a bit more difficult.
I guess not really a yeah. So I was with Penimah and Shim. My first real experience with activism here in New Jersey around Kaporos this past year, and Penimah and Shim were just so instrumental in the entire process, and couldn't have done it without them in terms of saving chickens. Over almost 200 or 300 chickens that we were able to save. But what for you guys, what memories stand out the most? Like, what shocked you or surprised you the most about your experiences? What gives you hope about what you experienced directly? You've already given us so many great tips for next year, and this has been so comprehensive that I have to go over the recording and really, really let this sink in. But anything like when you think about this past Kaporos year, what stands out for you, Penimah and Shim? Personally, even.
I would say which is very much in line with so much of what we heard from Rabbi Akiva, is the openness of certain authoritative figures in their community to speak with us. I started a relationship, a back and forth with actually one of the butchers. I was at the place filming and he was there slaughtering. He saw my filming and he got a little irritated. He said, please don't film me. You didn't ask permission. I don't want to be filmed. So I put my phone away and I listened, but I hung around for a while and we just struck up a conversation. And he turned out to be one of the nicest guys, to me at least, of course. And he was engaged in something that I found to be beyond vicious. But in just personal discussions, him and myself, we really kind of hit it off and have exchanged a few messages since then. And he's reached out and said, hi, how's it going? Shabbat Shalom before Shabbat. And I'll be speaking with him further. We haven't really had a real sit-down chat about Kaporos and about the ethics of slaughtering chickens yet. But he has said that he's aware of the issues that I would bring up, and he can't say he disagrees with all of them, but for him, it's a business, and the Bible that he believes in says that this is okay, and he's an observant Jew, and then according to Jewish law, it's okay. But I'm looking forward to that discussion, and he's a butcher. He's a shochet. This is what he does, and the amount of reach that he would have in a community like this, if he were to start seeing things from kind of a different perspective, I think would be tremendous. So I would say going into it with just an open mind and an open heart, and not seeing the people that are engaged in these activities as basically demons, how their minds are bent on causing pain and agony, even though we see that's what they're doing. That's not what they're trying to do. And seeing them as human beings and being open to have a dialogue and to listen and to speak as well.
I guess my biggest takeaway from this past year was kind of a realization that I had from talking with people in the community, and also the same butcher that Shim's talking about. These communities aren't around animals very often, if at all. Pretty much nobody has any companion animals or pets. So really the only time they might interact with an animal, like a live animal, might be Kaporos. I heard from some people that the way that they think about these chickens is, they're so genetically modified that they're like lumps of plastic. They're like plastic bags. Like they don't have feelings, they don't have nerves, they don't think, they don't have brains. They're just, tools to be used by human beings. And this chicken that, they're grabbing and swinging and that's screaming or pooping on their head sometimes, that's really the only interaction they have with a live animal. So when you think of it like that, it's not hard to believe that they, maybe don't have a lot of initial compassion if you're not around animals very often. But hopefully, a lot of the discussions that we had with them and ongoing communication efforts and ongoing protests will help them realize more, that these animals are not plastic bags or inanimate objects. They are living, breathing creatures. But it was just kind of astonishing, like to really realize that. I saw another question come. It says a question for Shimon based off what Penimah just shared. Is there a possibility in getting the butcher and rabbis to visit a sanctuary? Do you think that might be a possibility?
I'll definitely ask him. The worst that could happen is he'll say thanks, no thanks. But what was great was Penimah and I were showing this butcher and the other rabbis their pictures of the chickens, and we actually saved some geese they had as well. I don't know what they were going to do with the geese, but we brought them to sanctuaries and we gave them names, and we would send them pictures and show them pictures and show how well and happy the chickens were doing. And it brought a smile to their face, and they loved seeing this. And I think they were very moved by the compassion that we had for these animals and by the kind of life they saw the animals go on to live. So I love that idea, and I can definitely bring it up and hope for the best. Thank you for the suggestion.
I just saw another question asking about the Miami or South Florida Jewish animal rights activists. We have a big Jewish community down here, and they do practice Kaporos. I'm not sure if there have been any activism actions down there during Kaporos, but I could be wrong. I, off the top of my head, don't know. I mean, there's definitely a lot of activists in South Florida, in Miami and Florida in general. I can't think off the top of my head of anybody I know that's specifically Jewish. But if they do chickens as Kaporos down there, then there might be larger organizations that just generally combat that. I don't know if they're Jewish or not, but I'll look into that, and I would love for to know myself. So I don't know if Shem, you know.
I don't know of anything.
But Juan, you can start. You can start.
Yeah, you definitely don't have to be Jewish to start an action for chickens against using chickens as Kaporos. I think that it would be great if there were, a Jewish animal rights activist that wanted to start that up. And I think if that person is there, then they should, be given the platform. But don't wait for somebody. If the animals need every single person in the world speaking up for them. So don't shy away from starting your own effort against Kaporos.
I have maybe one final question for Rabbi Akiva. It's a little off the topic of Kaporos, but just in general, I know you promote veganism in the Jewish community in Israel through social media, and I guess in person as well. So I'm curious, how's that going? Like, have you seen a good amount of people going vegan there? Or I think that there's a large vegan community in Israel in general. I understand it's one of the countries that has the most amount of vegans. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. Per capita, Israel is the most vegan country in the world, which is amazing to see. And we're not just a startup nation or the high-tech nation, but we're also the vegan nation on some level, which is great. It's a good question. So I basically, I've been teaching about these topics for many years, in kind of in-person settings, but just about a year ago, I brought it onto social media. I should have started earlier, but I'm also really excited that even started. And I have to say, thank God the feedback and the response has been tremendous. It's just brought me personally more into the vegan activist world, both in Israel and America, more than they have been in a very long time. And it's also given me I love to share, I love to teach, specifically about these things. It's just been just given me another kind of medium and platform through which to do that. And like just last night, was it last night? Yesterday? Yeah, I did an Instagram live with another vegan activist here in Israel. Over Instagram, and she left me a message today, and she's like, I'm getting all of these messages from people who said they were, so inspired by our conversation. They're thinking about going vegan now. They didn't realize how much Judaism has to say about veganism. So it really is inspiring to see, what one post, one video, what interview could do, especially as you keep doing that. So it is really exciting. It's really inspiring. It's keeping me going, doing it, because I see it's really having an impact. And I just look forward to, look, there's a whole story how I even got involved with this, with Penimah and with Shimon and with AAM and Peter's on this call. It's through people who I've been meeting through all of this vegan rabbi work. There's a woman here in Israel called Jane Levy who connected me with Peter. So there's lots of connections happening. And it's really exciting. And I feel like social media obviously has this ability to bring us together, even across the ocean, and to help each other to do this really important work.
And is Israel the first and only country to go for free? Is that true? And how do you feel about that? Or is that not?
It is. It's very exciting. It's very exciting for sure, and I don't want to spoil the celebration. But two things. One, you don't see a lot of fur here. It is hot. It's the Middle East, so I literally don't know if I've ever seen anyone wear a fur coat. Maybe have some fur lining and whatever. I'm from New York, when it gets cold many months of the year, and I saw tons of fur coats growing up. So that's one thing. Again, still a nice thing that legislation was passed, but even the legislation is not perfect. Right? Not to bring up something else negative about the ultra-Orthodox community, but they are the biggest so the Hasidic community specifically, they have those first, what they're called shtreimels. They're like these hats that they wear on Shabbat and holidays. And that's a whole nother thing. We can have a whole workshop just about that. And talking about Jane Levy, we're going to be doing something about that, making a video. She's organizing a protest against that. Again, another thing that's a custom, you don't have to have a fur hat. You can actually have fake fur, right? That looks just the same, looks just as nice if you think it looks nice, and you don't have to hurt any animals. So why am I bringing that up? Sorry, I wasn't being specific enough. The law still allows those fur hats to be imported into the country. So that's because it's a religious item, there's a legal exception for that. So again, if you walk around Israel for like 6 months, probably the only fur you're going to see is on the head of Hasidic men on Shabbat and holidays, and that's not covered by the law. So, there's still work to do. And again, when it comes to fur offenses, Israel is probably at the bottom of the list of countries, adding to this problem. But still, it is nice to see that, that there is sensitivity in the Israeli government about this, so much so that they actually pass legislation, which we know is not a simple thing in any government, especially in Israel. So it's still an accomplishment, and we should celebrate even those small accomplishments.
Yeah, kind of going along with that. I remember when California became the first state to ban fur in America. Everybody was like very, very excited. And it's kind of the same thing like with Israel, how many people are wearing fur in California. And also there's still the exemption for religious items so I think that it's definitely a great precedent that Israel's setting, being the first country to ban fur. And I think it's more of like a principle thing than like, and religious exemption laws are so much harder to combat than just a general like fur for fashion ban. So yeah, still a long way to come, but a great example, I think. But with that, if nobody has any more questions, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Again, this workshop was brought to you by Animal Activism Mentorship. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship. And our website is animalactivismmentorship.com to sign up for a free mentor. And also, this workshop will be posted within 48 hours on our YouTube. So thank you all so much for attending, and have a great rest of your day. Depending on where you are, have a great night. All right, bye everybody.